We're on item number 8.1, presentation from the Director of Development Services regarding Agricultural Land Commission. Welcome and welcome, Scott. Thank you. So what we'll do is we'll have the presentation, and then we'll see if there's questions from council, and if there's questions from the gallery, for sure we'll do our best to listen and try to answer them. So we'll turn it over to you, Director of Development Services.
Thank you, Worship. Last week, our senior planner, Scott Beeching, and I, and Councillor Lavery attended a Agricultural Land Commission seminar in Kelowna. It was an all-day event, and the topic of discussion was Bill 52, which was adopted by the provincial government in February of this year. And it affects the Agricultural Land Commission Act and regulations. And attached in your agenda are two documents. One is Information Bulletin number 5, and the other is BC Regs 30/2019, which represents the changes to the regulations and act. Those two documents are easy to read, I think. Even the regulations are. They're well laid out. Particularly Bulletin 5, which is up on the screen. It's 15 pages, and it covers all the changes. So if you're talking to anyone out there in the community, this document is the best to reference, I think. Just a bit of history on the Agricultural Land Reserve, and by the way, I sent out invites to this meeting to the Shuswap construction industry professionals, the local president of the Okanagan Shuswap Real Estate Board, and our Agricultural Advisory Committee.
Thank you for doing that.
And our building department. So just a bit of history on the ALR. It came into force in 1973 across the province, and you could compare it to a provincial zone. If you look at a provincial map of BC, there's some blobs of green areas throughout the province, which represent 5% of the land base of BC. And out of that 5%, about 1.8% of that, or 1.8% is good agricultural land, farmable land. The current structure of the ALC still consists of 6 panels for various regions in the province, and Salmon Arm is in the Okanagan Okanagan region. And it is represented by a vice chair and 2 panel members. So that structure is still in effect. And there's another amendment to an ALC regulation that has had second reading down in Victoria. And there's going to be some tweaks to the structure. And there's also been a change. There's several changes to the application process. One of them has to do with exclusion of land. With exclusion applications, individual property owners will no longer be able to make those applications. It will be the local government who can make an application. So that's going to be a big change. The presentation today does not get into that. It's mostly to do with Bill 52 and the 15-page document. We do have a PowerPoint presentation here, just to summarize a summary of the legislation. So Bill 52 came into effect on February 22nd. The 3 main issues, according to the ALC, ending the proliferation of mansions and estates in the ALR. There is now a cap on the floor area for a residence, 500 square meters. I'll show you a diagram in an upcoming slide which explains that a little better.
Can I just
And
interject there? So our local legislation that we passed is paralleling that anyways, is it not?
Your Worship, I'll get into that. We have a slide that covers that.
Sure.
And 1,000 square meters of fill can be removed or altered for the home plate. 1,000 square meters of fill. So if one has, say, 5 or 10 acres of land and they want to prepare a site for a residence, they're allowed to remove up to 1,000 square meters of fill. And to give you an idea of how big 1,000 square meters is, our back parking lot at City Hall is almost exactly 1,000 square meters. So that's a good reference for anybody wanting to know what 1,000 square meters looks like. Ending the dumping of illegal fill in the ALR. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And ending the two-zone separation of the ALR. Up until February, the ALR was divided into 2 zones with the 6 regions. Salmon Arm, being in the Okanagan region, was in Zone 1. And Zone 2 encompassed mostly the north of BC and the southeastern corner. I guess the regional district there is the East Kootenay Regional District. And there is different rules, I guess you could say. In Zone 2, a little bit more flexible maybe. There was an allowance for 2 dwellings without having to go through applications. So the biggest change now is you can really only have one house as far as residential uses go. You can have one house with a maximum floor area of 500 square meters. And this diagram here, which is in the information bulletin 5, shows how floor area can be calculated. It does not include a garage or a basement. There's a bit of wording there on the garage size, if less than 42 square meters. So when a building permit application comes in for a house into the city, our building inspectors will have to calculate that floor area, and the applicant will have to show on the plans the floor area. And the ALC would like us to ensure that the 1,000 square meter footprint I discussed earlier is not exceeded as well. With an application for, say, a detached suite, which is allowed in our zoning bylaw, or a compassionate use mobile home, or a second residence for farm help, that being a mobile home, we can no longer allow that. An application has to be made to the ALC, and the application is called a non-adhering residential use application, similar to the non-farm use applications that you've seen over the years. And the thing that is difficult for staff to wrap our head around is the new regulations state boldly that the commission is prohibited from granting permission for an additional residence unless the additional residence is necessary for farm use. So in other words, any secondary residence, whether it's a detached suite or a mobile home, has to be for farm use, and it has to meet the ALC's criteria for farm help. So in the last month, we've actually had 4 of these applications come into us. Some of them haven't paid yet. Some of them have, and we're working on those. We're doing a preliminary review. And some of those are not for farm help. In one instance, we advised the applicant that, okay, we know now that the commission is prohibited from granting permission for one of these, so if you continue with this application, you could be wasting your money. Similar to the cannabis retail store applications that we've had lately, where we've reached our limit of 4 stores in the commercial area, and we advise applicants not to apply. They can take that risk and make an application. So we have a couple, or not a couple, we have about 4 under review. And if these do make it to the ALC, assuming council approves them, then the ALC judges whether the proposed second dwelling is proportional to the type and scale of agriculture taking place on the property. So that's a huge change. I think in some ways it's clearer. And when I said it was difficult for us to wrap our head around, it's because we were asking the Land Commission for clarity, and we were referring people to call them directly because we do not like to be the middle person with their regulations or be on the front line of interpreting ALC regulations. That can be quite dangerous and carries risk and liability. So we found out that when the people were calling the ALC, some of them were being advised to just make an application, and they weren't being told what you see there in red, which is kind of frustrating.
Can I just interrupt and just see if council has any questions over this particular piece? I just want to kind of summarize from my point of view to make sure I understand it properly. So if there's a person who owns ALC land in Salmon Arm who wants to apply for non-adhering residential use, which would mean residential use on their property, either within their house or detached for farm use, they come to council first. Is that right?
That's right. And before that, there were certain circumstances where a second residence, that being a mobile home, would be permitted without having to go to the ALC.
Okay, so council then, is our consideration to be whether that residence is for agricultural use or not? Like, it seems strange that we would be making that, trying to figure out whether that's applicable or not. But it seems like it wouldn't be worth passing it on to ALC unless it was for farm use. Do I understand that right?
Yes, that's a judgment call, and I don't have an answer yet on how we should evaluate such applications. There are four specific situations that we have in our zoning bylaw. We have compassionate use mobile homes. They're called type C permits, and they are intended for people who need care. And if you have a compassionate use mobile home on your property, you have to file an affidavit every year with the city saying that the mobile home is for compassionate use. That can continue for existing ones that are approved by the city already, because that used to be allowed by the ALC up until February. So those are grandfathered. However, if the use ceases and somebody wants to bring in another mobile home, then they would have to go to the ALC and demonstrate that it's for farm help. We haven't tweaked our policies for this. It just happened. I mean, you know what it's like to chase ALC and provincial regulations. It's not an easy thing to do. Sometimes we have to adjust our regulations, and actually the ALC is expecting us to adjust our regulations within a year from now to be consistent with this. The second type of situation is the detached suite. Our zoning bylaw allows detached suites in the agricultural zones, A1, A2, A3. And we have a disclaimer there saying that a detached suite is permitted subject to ALC regulations. I take that as if the ALC approves it, than our zoning bylaw allows it. And the third type is a mobile home for farm help on lots greater than or equal to 8 hectares in area. In that case, the property has to have farm classification, and the owner has to sign an affidavit saying it's for farm help. That's an example where the local government, such as us, could regulate it without having to go to the ALC. That's no longer in effect.
What about a suite inside the residence on agricultural land?
The ALC still allows that.
Doesn't have to be for farm use.
No.
Can we pass that here? Like, does that have to go to the ALC or not?
It's okay. It's in our zoning bylaw already. So secondary suites in a house are permitted in the A zones. We did an amendment to our zoning bylaw about 6 years ago to allow that, and those don't have to go to the ALC. So if a property owner comes into City Hall and applies for a building permit for a house with a secondary suite, has to meet building code and has to meet our zoning, doesn't have to go to the ALC.
Okay, thank you.
The other amendment that the city did.
Staying on, I'll just get Councillor Eliason's question.
Yeah, I thought that everything that came in after, if you apply for a building permit for anything after February 19th for a building in the ALC, I thought that has to go to them for review, especially if you're adding a secondary suite. Like any new buildings after February 19th have to go to them, don't they?
Scott, do you know the answer to that? My understanding is they don't have to go to the ALC for a secondary suite in a house.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well.
Okay, we can confirm that at a later time, but thank you for bringing that up. Okay, please.
I just referring to page 4 of the first document that you sent that said new construction of a residence on ALR that has no existing residence. If the proposed principal residence is built on vacant land, then the commission will consider it. It says if it's under 500 meters or 500 square meters, that's the case where they don't require anything? Or is that just over 500 where they require, which we wouldn't allow?
That's correct. If it's over 500 square meters total floor area.
They require everything?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, please continue.
And then approximately 2 years ago, we amended our zoning bylaw to put a maximum building area for a residence of 500 square meters. But that's footprint. That's not total floor area. So that is now inconsistent. And we have one zone in our zoning bylaw that was adopted about 3 years ago. It's the only zone in Salmon Arm that allows 2 full-size single-family dwellings. It's a comprehensive development zone in the Salmon Valley. And with that application, the Agricultural Advisory Committee and staff and City Council were all convinced that this was a bona fide farming operation, a large, it was either a poultry farm or a dairy farm, I can't remember, poultry. And so we created a CD zone to allow 2 dwellings. That situation would not be allowed today. This slide here shows sections of our agricultural zones. For example, A2, A3, and A1, they all have regulations, which I just spoke to, regarding detached suites, where properties are allowed to have a second residence for farm help, 8 hectares or larger in area. These are now inconsistent. Need to advance here. Here we go. One of the regulations relates to home occupation use, and the ALC still allows home occupation as long as the structure occupying an area for a home occupation does not exceed 100 square meters. This is a soil classification map, and the discussion last week at the seminar, there was a lot of questions from the audience about ALR boundaries and asking if there's going to be a province-wide review of the boundaries based on the fact that the original boundaries were created in 1972 with Canadian land inventory mapping. The assumption was by some that the data was old and out of date and the boundaries should be relooked at. Apparently there was a comprehensive boundary review done in the 1980s. The ALC seems satisfied with the boundaries that exist today. And the argument that we often hear at the local government level is that the higher class soils, such as 4, 5, or more like 5, 6, and 7, they're not suitable for growing various things, and they should be allowed to come out if it makes sense. The Land Commission and the Ministry of Agricultural's philosophy on that is that's not the case. The higher class soils actually provide a buffer between the good soils and other land uses out there. And Scott put together this photo here of Larch Hills Winery and then superimposed the soil classifications over top to show how topography impacts the soil classification. So you can see at the ridges of the surrounding hills, Hunter's Range, you have class 7, and then down where the grapes are grown, you have class 4. And the Okanagan area is considered one of 2 golden triangles in the ALR. The other golden triangle is the Lower Mainland, and they are seen to have the most productive, best soils, and produce the highest farm receipts in the province. Oh, there's some class 1. And last, I'd like to conclude this slide presentation just to show you that Salmon Arm has a lot of ALR land in it. Out of 155 square kilometers of land, 61 square kilometers is ALR. About 18 square kilometers is planned for urban development. And out of that 18 square kilometers, about 2.7 square kilometers remains for residential development.
Thank you very much. Scott, did you have anything that you wanted to add before we opened it up for questions?
No, I'm just here to answer questions, I guess. Thank you, Your
Okay.
Worship.
And Councillor Lavery, I know that you attended the workshop. Did you want to add anything at this time?
No, Your Worship, I had another meeting down there. I briefly attended for about an hour, so my insights are minimal on this.
Okay. I'll open up for questions from council and then from the audience as well. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Worship. And just one quick question. This doesn't preclude somebody for applying like we had last week for an exclusion. That process still can exist, but I would suggest highly unlikely.
Your Worship, my understanding is the exclusion application process is being changed right now. That, I believe, is the Bill 15, which has had second reading.
So the example we had, was it last week, of somebody applying for an exclusion for an existing building above a garage, they're applying for an actual exclusion, and that may not be possible after the bill changes.
I don't think it will be possible.
Okay.
Okay. Councillor Eliason.
Yeah, not really a question, but a few years ago when Frank Leonard from Saanich was introduced as the chair of the LC, I met with him, and he explained to me that things within the agricultural land reserve were going to change drastically, and that he was on a mission to find a new CEO to replace him. And with that came Kim Grout, who I've known for quite a while, and she was quite frank and said that things are going to tighten up and toughen up. And so I've seen these changes in the pipeline for quite some time, and now they finally got here. My understanding is that we will still be a gatekeeper for applications, but they're going to want to review everything. And just if you aren't aware, the LC has received more money in the last 4 years than they've ever had. They have more staff in the last 4 years than they've ever had, and they have more resources than they've ever had. Not to say that they're going to be, and they have self-imposed timelines on your application. So it's not send it out and we'll see when we get back. There was a clear mandate to see how long that will take. But my expectation is to narrow down or to strengthen up the number of applications they receive, is that there will be a lot of no's in the early going. Not all boards stick to that policy on supporting those things, as we've seen recently. However, I expect them to come in with a hard line and then maybe soften it up in the end. But I expect to see a lot of no's coming out from applications for exclusions or exemptions or anything like that in the near future to support their staff and then give a proper direction of where they're going with it. So this is good information, and thanks staff for bringing it forward.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor Eliason, for that history. That's interesting to know. Could I just ask, it's on topic, but if someone wants to get a building permit for a farm use building on agricultural land, can you just go through the process for us, just so we understand?
Maybe, if you don't mind, Your Worship, I'd like Morris to speak to that one.
Sure. Morris, do you want to come up to the microphone, because then everybody will be able to hear you?
Morning, Your Worship.
Good morning. Thanks for being here.
Not a problem. We currently, in our building bylaw, do not require building permits for bona fide agricultural buildings. So nobody comes in to ask, they just go ahead and do it. So
Okay,
they're
so-
expected to meet the setbacks in the zoning bylaw, but we don't actually do inspections.
Okay, that was my next question. So if I own a piece of property and I want to build a barn, it's up to me to meet the setbacks, but I don't have to come get a building permit or anything like that.
Correct.
What about riparian area regulations? If it's agricultural land, do they apply or not?
We've been relying on the Ministry of Environment to look after their affair. So if they see something going on, then they need to look after it. If we see something egregious going on, we can obviously call them, but we try and leave that in their court.
I see. Do the regulations apply to agricultural buildings? Like the riparian area regulations?
I think they're exempt to a certain extent. I'm not totally clear on that, but we.
Okay, that's not our
generally-
jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Councillor Cannon has a question. I'm not sure if it's for Morris or
I have a
not.
question. So on those agricultural farm buildings, they don't need a building permit, but do they have to go through like an electrical permit, like when they build those?
I don't deal with the electrical permits. That's a provincial jurisdiction. I suspect they would have to go through an electrical permit, but that's just a supposition on my part.
Okay. And there is like quite a few farm buildings on larger farm operations that build the farm building and they have a residential area up above. What's the process that gets checked? I'm thinking of a few like large dairy farm operations that have.
I know of a few mixed-use buildings in town, so we would determine what the hazard is in the farm building. Like if it's equipment storage, for instance, that would be deemed a low hazard, and so we would need a 1 hour fire separation between the residents and the low hazard occupancy. If it's a higher hazard, like if it's a repair garage for farm equipment, then it's a higher hazard and we'd require a 2 hour fire separation.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Can I ask a cannabis question? Okay. So,
Thanks, Maura.
thank you, Morris. On page 59, which is the actual regulation, it talks about cannabis. So I just trying to make sure that I understand it. The way it looks to me is that cannabis production is permitted outdoors in a field in the open, or inside a structure as long as the structure has a base consisting entirely of soil on agricultural land. Do I have that right?
Yes, and from what we heard at the seminar last week, local government can attempt to try and regulate the foundation. So it is considered a farm use, the growing of cannabis. And if the local government doesn't choose to regulate, they could now have a concrete base. It seems to have flipped again.
Okay, so if there's a farmer out there who puts up a temporary building to grow cannabis, they don't have to come to City Hall.
That's correct. It's like a farm building for keeping chickens or greenhouse.
Okay, but if they wanted to put a cement base there on the building, they would have to come to City Hall.
No.
Okay, so on agricultural land, then we don't have any control over cannabis production.
We don't have to have control, but it's one of those regulations that they're saying local government can control it if they want, or they can try to control it if they want to. Apparently, we could have a farm bylaw, which is a special kind of zoning bylaw that has to go through the Ministry of Agriculture. We don't have farm bylaws in Salmon Arm, but that is one way we could attempt to regulate the foundation of a cannabis growing production facility.
Okay, I'm not asking to control it. I just want to know when people ask me. So, okay.
Your Worship, it's a farm use, it's allowed
Okay, that's what
in
I
the
needed.
ALR.
That's what I needed to know. Councillor Lavery.
Yes, thanks, Your Worship. And a number of the questions I was going to ask have been asked already. So some questions, some commentary as well here. So first of all, the slides were really helpful. Thanks for doing that. And I especially like the Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 4 overlay. That was good. For my, in terms of overview, I tend to share Councillor Eliasson's view of what's happened and what's on the horizon. There's no doubt, and again, this is commentary, that the communication of the impact of these changes has been minimal, lousy, and has created a lot of confusion, even up to the day before, the day of the seminar that was put down there. There's been a lot of confusion, and it's been the way it's been rolled out. And then there's whether one agrees or not. For my own understanding, through you, Your Worship, to staff, so we have a footprint limitation of 500 meters squared.
It's 1,000 square meters, Your Worship. Footprint?
A footprint or fill? Yeah.
Oh, you mean City of Salmon Arm? Yes.
The City of Salmon Arm, yeah.
We have a limit of 500 square meters for residents.
And that is for footprint.
That's correct.
And that aspect would need to be changed at some point, probably sooner than later, to be compliant with the provincial legislation.
Yes, until we make the changes necessary, I'm thinking we are going to put a disclaimer on all the sections of our zoning bylaw that speak to anything related to the ALR, saying that the ALC regulations supersede the zoning bylaw. And I mean, we don't want people out there looking at the A2 zone thinking they can build a detached suite, saying city zoning bylaw says you can do it. Although I think the detached suite provision is actually okay the way it is, but there's other ones that need to be adjusted, and we'll need time for that.
Thank you for that. And I'm usually pretty good in metric, but 500 meters squared is hard for me to visualize. So going back to imperial measurements, that's over 5,000 square feet, 5,300 square feet, 5,400 square feet for footprint for a house as it currently stands based on our bylaw.
500 square meters is approximately, it's over, just slightly over 5,000 square feet, not 6,000 square feet. It would be about half of this parking lot.
Yeah. Thank you. And getting back to the questions that Mayor Harrison was asking about farm bylaws for concrete use, whether we have them or not. So is the interpretation of this then that the province has punted this down to the local governments to get out of a controversial, because there's a lot of controversy over there and very strong opposing views about whether cannabis production facilities on agricultural land should have a concrete base or not. So is staff's interpretation that that, again, just so I'm clear, local governments would have the controlling factor of whether there's a non-soil based use, a concrete based use, but the province is saying we're stepping out of this regulation? Is that the general sense? Through you, Your Worship?
Your Worship, I think we've gone in a big circle about 2 years ago. As Councillor Eliason was saying with the former chair of the ALC, Frank Leonard, we received a bulletin similar to bulletin number 5 that you have in your agenda, basically saying that production of cannabis and facilities are farm use, and there's no mention of a soil-bound foundation or non-soil bound. It was just a farm use. And that's where we are today. Between today and back then 2 years ago, there's the ALC, and when I say the ALC, I really mean the Ministry of Agriculture, because they're the ones that write the regulations. It's not the ALC, for clarification. But changes were made to try and suggest that any facility growing cannabis cannot have a permanent concrete foundation. It has to be soil bound. And for some reason, the Ministry of Agriculture backtracked on that without really telling us until a couple of months ago. So in my opinion, we're back to where we are 2 years ago.
Okay, thank you for that. And Your Worship, just 2 general comments. I think that this is another example of the tail wagging the dog here. I mean, there's no doubt that the proliferation of large mansions and sort of lifestyle estates in the ALR, in the Lower Mainland, was really inflating land prices and putting access to agricultural land out of the range of people who might want to farm it. And I guess I just comment on the second aspect of this too, that the dumping of illegal fill in the ALR, so some of these changes at least has been, in my view, a positive approach to this, but it really has, in applying it to our area, created a lot of confusion and a lot of differences of opinion, obviously, about how to proceed. I thank staff for being there. I think that we've got I guess a plan in the next while as well. We try to align with the new provincial regulations of moving forward. The information is helpful for me anyhow in my consideration of this, and we'll just struggle on through this as things become compliant. So thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Flynn.
Thank you, Worship. And I just want to make sure I understand the crux of the change. The actual landowner now has no ability to go to the ALC without local government support. And the landowner has no rights, as I understand it, with the ALC. They have to have government support for their application. Is that correct?
For a residential application, which is now called the non-adhering residential use application, for the scenarios I mentioned, have to go through our council first.
Right. And that includes a secondary dwelling that's specifically said can't have unless it's for farm use, but even for farm use, it can't happen.
That's correct. Still has to go to the ALC.
But we basically have to say it's highly unlikely, like we're gonna have to preface, it's almost like there's a step with us that's a useless step, but it has to happen.
It would be nice if they went directly to the ALC.
Okay, I will reserve my comments to my inside voice.
Thank you, Councillor Flynn. Councillor Lassen,
Are we gonna change our fees?
Director of Development Services.
Your worship, I'm working on a comprehensive fee report for all our planning and development application fees. I'm actually looking at the ALC portion of that. And some jurisdictions like Kelowna, they charge extra because we only receive $300 of the $1,500 fee.
We've discussed this previously. I just wanted to know, this is a new opportunity for us in the city of Salmon Arm, I guess we get to say, to better service our residents. And sometimes that service costs us money and staff time. So when staff brings that back, I'd look at some increases if available.
Thank you. And, you know, when applications come forward now to the city, really what the question is do we authorize moving the application forward? We don't necessarily have to make judgment on the application. And so there's a big difference between those two things. And the problem that we were finding when homeowners could apply directly to the ALC, they went to the ALC, then it came back to the city, and in between that gap, the community might react, and we did not have an opportunity to have all the information there prior. So it's a bit tricky. Could I just ask about temporary use permits on agricultural land? For example, Roots and Blues, parking, those kind of things. Is there any changes to the procedure for temporary use permits?
No, for example, the Roots and Blues campground, they are going to have to apply for a non-farm use permit after this year's festival if they want to continue.
Okay. Is there an opportunity to apply for multi-year, or does it have to be 1 year at a time now?
The ALC previously approved 3 years.
That's right.
It's really up to them what they'll decide. I don't know if they'll change it to a 1 year approval, but the Roots and Blues can apply for however long they want.
Okay. And so, I'm not particularly talking about Roots and Blues, but any resident out there who wants a temporary use on agricultural land of a non-agricultural use would have to come to the city, and the city would have to authorize that moving forward to the ALC. The city cannot grant a temporary use permit without the ALC, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Councillor Flynn?
Yeah, could I just go back to that map that had Salmon Arm with the ALR around us? With the yellow? Yeah, okay, green, sorry. Oh, that's the one I wanted.
Sorry.
Still want it.
Okay, I'll just...
I guess what I wanted to comment, and this isn't my inside voice that I'm going to keep quiet, but when you look at this map and see the lake and know where the mountains are, I think the chances of us ever getting pieces of land out like we got around Hillcrest and pieces of land like we got on Upper Lakeshore out in bulk from the ALC during our next review of our OCP, I would suggest are somewhere between 0 and 2%. I don't think we'll see that happen again. So I think moving forward as a community and as staff, I think we need to look at rules and regulations that make infill and hillside development more cost effective because we don't have anywhere to go. And if they're not going to allow those types of exclusions like we've had in the past, which my guess is they're not, we are really constrained, and infill and effective use of what is available is way more important. So just from a philosophical point of view, I think we need to really be focusing on infill and perhaps looking at, if you're taking a small lot and making it 2, that doesn't have all the costs, but as soon as you go to 3, I believe it does. I think we're gonna have to revisit that as a community. So that's my positive inside voice. And I will not comment on what I think of the changes to the agricultural land reserve.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Flynn, for those thoughts. Councillor Lavery, and then I'll open it up to anyone in the audience that has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor Harrison, for a second time. And again, thanks to staff for the slideshow. I was wondering if the slide deck could be shared with council. Particularly when I look at this slide here, developable area, we're often talking about this, and as Councillor Flynn points out, the constraints of how we grow and where we grow, and looking at infill. It's just a great slide, and I'd like to have some access for that. I'm regularly talking about that, and to actually be able to pull that up as a visual graphic in the midst of that would be incredibly helpful. So could, through your worship, could staff share the slide deck with us?
Yes, please, thank you.
Your worship, yes, I can share it with council. I just have a cautionary note on that, is that this slideshow does not in any way cover everything that's been changed by the ALC Act.
No, I appreciate that, thank you. And I appreciate your comments, Councillor Flynn, and I think the opportunity to remove non-agricultural land from the ALR, as we did in the last OCP, I think you're right, especially midstream, it's very unlikely. But I think as we did in the last OCP, we heard from the community and we made the case about creating buffers, and it really was a win-win solution. So I'm not discounting that completely, because I think there is lands that are in the ALR that are not farmable that may be close enough to infrastructure that might be considered at the next OCP review, which is probably about 2021, 22. So, is there any people in the audience who have a question or a comment that they might like to ask? Because if there is, please come forward. Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Councillors, any other comments? I really appreciate the work of the Development Services Department. Thank you, Scott, for being a part of that as well. Okay, we have a motion to adjourn this meeting.
Moved by Councillor Lavery, second by Councillor Flynn, that the Development and Planning Services Committee meeting of June 3rd, 2019 be adjourned.
All those in favor? Thank you very much.